Greetings, Crafted Calling. Jeremiah Fyffe here, and I want to welcome you to today's podcast. Crafted Calling is a whetstone to help pastors and other ministry leaders sharpen their ministry tools and hone their craft. As people whose labor is in shepherding of souls, we recognize their freedom in both their human dignity and in their Christian liberty. The question is then, how do we shepherd these souls in an age of license? A little over a year ago, I met Brad Littlejohn through a mutual friend, Dale Stenberg, who's the headmaster of Pietist Classical Christian. In January of this year, Dale and Pietist Classical invited Brad to come to Brevard County to share about his new book, Called to Freedom, Retrieving Christian Liberty in an Age of License. Many partners from Crosspoint Coast, where I serve as pastor, also joined us for the evening presentation, and I highly commend Brad's book to anyone who's listening. Now, as I read Called to Freedom, there are many questions that came to my mind relevant to the issues of leadership in the church that we're going to walk through in this conversation. So, Brad, I want to thank you for serving us on that evening in January, as well as serving us here on the Crafted Calling podcast. So thank you for joining us, and I'd love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. My pleasure. I did my doctoral work on this topic of the meaning of Christian liberty in the Reformation more than 10 years ago. It's something I've been kind of thinking about and chewing on. Then going back about 15 years, my vocation for many years was kind of I described myself as kind of an academic entrepreneur. I created a nonprofit, the Davenant Institute, working at the intersection of the church and the academy. I sometimes described it as a kind of theological education think tank. And I did that up through early last year. But I've been, for the last few years, transitioning a little, kind of had one foot in the public policy world and with traditional think tanks. And one of the areas that I was have been most interested in as a Christian ethicist and thinking about freedom and the ways in which we are freed, our assertions of freedom lead us into unfreedom in the modern world, is our relationship to technology. And so through that, I've become more involved in various tech policy efforts here in DC and around the country. So I say here in DC. I moved to DC last summer, and so I'm now a director of programs and education at a think tank named American Compass here.
Wonderful, wonderful. I appreciate it, Brad. One of the things that when I began reading your book, you had said that you were interested in this for many years. This wasn't just a doctoral thesis for you. This was something that was really a genuine personal area of interest. I know for myself, since being a small child, I've been interested in the idea of the truth. I remember walking around a tape library with my dad and just asking, like, where is the section on truth? And it struck me that it's clear that you have a passion for this area of study, that this is, it wasn't just a scholarly work. It was a scholarly work that was born of a life of investigation. The one thing that I was surprised by was that I expected sort of a philosophical exploration. I expected clarity of expression, but so I wasn't surprised by some of your connections with political implications. Wasn't surprised by your clarity, but I was surprised by how theological the book was. And as you surveyed a variety of definitions at the beginning of the book about freedom, there is a section where you wrote, all these versions center, all of these sort of various definitions center on the human ability to exercise moral agency, which is our capacity for purposeful or meaningful action. I'd love for you to just take just a second to share that grounding definition for us to sort of orient what you mean by freedom.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the definition I give there, kind of rolling together everything that I try to say in the book, and a lot of this is just full, credit where credit's due, is in some ways expounding on the ideas of my doctoral advisor, Oliver O'Donovan. So is this idea, the capacity for meaningful action. And let me just kind of take each of those words in reverse order. So the idea of action, human action is goal oriented. Uh, there are things that we do as human beings that we don't really think of as actions. Like if I may, it's probably at some point during this podcast interview, I'll just absentmindedly scratch my beard or whatever. Our mutual friend Dale does a sort of very grand beard stroking.
Yes, I will try to fulfill his role in
Yes,
this podcast.
every 20 seconds or so.
Yes,
But
yes.
it generally doesn't rise to the level of an action because there's no
Mhm, mhm,
conscious intention or purpose behind it. That which makes us genuinely human, and that in which our human freedom consists, is the ability to uh, to do things guided toward a purpose or end that we're seeking to pursue. So, without that purposefulness, you don't really have freedom, and that's important for the account of freedom that I develop in the book. That means that simply being um, just kind of left alone to do whatever you feel like doesn't necessarily qualify as freedom, because quite often we can be just sort of pulled around by our desires and overpowered by our desires and not actually acting in pursuit of an end.
mhm,
So then I talk about it has to be meaningful action, which is to say, when we act as human beings, we we always intend our actions to be intelligible to other people in some way.
mhm.
And if they aren't, then we don't really experience it as a free action. Get example I give is, if you were dropped into the middle of the Amazon rainforest and, you had very friendly captors, but or maybe not even captors, but you were stranded there, and the tribespeople were very friendly, but would you have freedom of speech in that environment? Well, not really, because
Mhm,
they wouldn't understand anything you were trying to say, and you wouldn't understand anything they were trying to say.
mhm.
And so the freedom to exercise speech requires some kind of shared meaning, and we can broaden that out to think about all sorts of actions that we do as human beings presuppose a social context where there's manners, there's norms, there's conventions, and if you suddenly find yourself transplanted into a very different social context, and you realize that the norms that you had internalized before are wildly out of step with the norms of
Yeah,
this other community,
yeah.
you find that all of a sudden the kind of paralyzing. You don't know how to act anymore. So freedom requires that context of meaningful action, a community context, which is also important for the important point I develop in the book, the role of community in exercising freedom. And then the last thing I say, capacity for meaningful action. So capacity implies a positive capability, and this is, I think, a mistake we sometimes make in our thinking about freedom. We think of it merely as um, this kind of freedom is a characteristic of, like, I'm free. My external surroundings allow me freedom to act. Well, if I don't have the internal capacity to act, that's no use to me. I say, if um, a a quadriplegic that nobody's physically restraining, he may be externally free in the sense that nobody's physically restraining
Yes,
him, but he's not free to walk around because
yes,
he doesn't have the internal capacity. And
yes.
that becomes very much more important when we start thinking about, like, the moral capacity to exercise freedom. The person, and coming back to something I said earlier, the person who's a slave to their desires doesn't actually have the positive capability to act, however much they may be left alone by political
Mhm.
institutions or otherwise.
Yeah, there's so many things that I'd love to trace down in that, and you do, which is why I commend the book. One of the things that you were going at there at the end was this internal and external. One of the interesting things that in the example that you give of the quadriplegic, it seems like increasingly we view our bodies as external. So you might say, well, my body is what's constraining me from my internal agency to be able to move. I desire to move. I want to move. I act toward movement, but my body constrains me.
Hmm.
Also, thinking of our body as something other, external to our actual selves, that might be
Yeah.
a little. Certainly, you discuss that in the book, certainly, and it's certainly relevant, but maybe not central.
Yeah. Do you want me to dig into that right now? Or?
Sure, that'd be
Yeah, yeah.
wonderful.
I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. So I mean, I think that's something that I definitely come back to in the chapter on technology and
Hmm.
how we've moved from seeing the obstacles to our freedom in the we initially saw the obstacles to our freedom primarily in the limitations of the world around us, um, and not unreasonably so. For much of human history, people were sort of radically constrained by their environment, by the just the the rhythms of the seasons that they relied upon just for basic food and shelter, um, the limitations of their geography, um, the all the threats to bodily health, all these
Hmm.
things in our natural environment were constraints upon our freedom, and technology was developed as a way of trying to empower human beings with greater freedom from necessity, greater freedom to chart their own course, and overcome these obstacles of fallen nature around us. But at some point, in the 20th century, we get to where we've conquered most of those boundaries outside of us, and so then we
Hmm.
start to see the remaining limits of our sheer embodiment of our own physical nature is an obstacle to be overcome. So rather than the problem being that the world around us is getting in the way of our bodies, it's our own bodies are getting in the way of our minds, what we want to be, right? And you see that with um, the whole reproductive rights movement, which is trying to transcend the limits of natural bodily processes, and then finally the trans movement. And C.S. Lewis, it's really the fulfillment of what Lewis says in the Abolition of Man, where he says that when we are um, turning our technologies upon ourselves in order to gain greater freedom, we are both the subject and the object, and so we are the maximal freedom is kind of achieved at the cost of maximal slavery.
Yeah, I mean, it treats what we are as sort of a blank slate, that we aren't actually a thing, that actually exists, that that has that actually has a nature, a defined nature, but we can redefine the nature because we're actually a blank slate. That if there's anything that's written, it's myself, whatever in the world that is.
Hmm.
And in recent weeks at my church, I think I've used the word telos more times than ever before in a service, just because I'm like stumbling for what we're talking about. That not only do we have a nature, our nature itself has an end. And do we believe God about his end for us? If he knows our nature, he also knows our purpose. And much of technology is sort of trying to carve up ourselves for a manufactured, artificial, detached from nature purpose. It seems to me that in this day, um, with that just sort of being the sort of conception, the way that we tend to imagine ourselves, pastors, church leaders, um, would do well to do a great deal of thought to think of what freedom actually is. Because a lot of the way that you discuss freedom, and I'd like to go to a particular question with this, sounds more like constraint. Just as a listener, imagining the world the way that we tend to do in this cultural moment.
Hmm.
Um, and so your books is sort of the first half at least is framed around spiritual, moral, and political freedom. I wonder if you would take just a quick second to describe why. I believe it's just those three. I'm trying to remember if there's a fourth.
Yep.
Great. I would love it if you would just help to frame the distinguishing marks between those three freedoms, and particularly for ministry leaders. So why would we care about the last two? I mean, shouldn't we just be talking about spiritual things and avoid conversations about politics? Maybe do a couple more implications. Yeah, I would love to hear
Sure.
with you on
Yeah.
that.
So, so the spiritual freedom is a fundamentally inward freedom. So in terms of my distinction between inward and outward dimensions of freedom, spiritual freedom is an inward freedom. Political freedom is an outward freedom. And moral freedom is perhaps bridging the two. Now, spiritual freedom is above all the freedom from. Well, let's just talk about that. Yeah, distinction or put spiritual and moral freedom together as essentially the freedom of justification and the freedom of sanctification is the way I describe it, which is to say there are two distinct problems that sin poses for us, two different forms of slavery. So one is and what might come first to mind for us is the slavery to particular sins, particular besetting sins, sinful habits that we have. But and often that's what we're kind of fixated upon. That's what most of the world's religions are sort of, trying to address, or certainly most of the world's philosophers are trying to say, how can I become a better person? How can I overcome these bad habits and bad desires?
And that would be an issue of moral.
That's solving the issue of that's moral freedom, right? But there's more fundamental than that. Is how do I deal with the guilt of sin? How do I deal with the fear of death and punishment that come from the awareness that I am a sinful person? Sin in its totality has this crushing weight upon the soul, that where I feel myself to be alienated from God, the source of my being. I feel myself to be alienated from myself, and I therefore am burdened by guilt and this fear of punishment, right? And so that freedom that is given in justification, where we receive the promise of the gospel that Christ sets us free from the guilt of sin. Christ pays for the penalty of our sin. That's the most fundamental freedom of all. It solves the deepest problem, without which you can't really move on to solve the other problems. So it's important to keep, the main, the old line, the main thing is to keep the main thing, right? So,
Yeah.
That's
keep the
where
ground on the ground level. Yeah.
Right. So we have to make sure that we understand what is it that's so important and distinctive about spiritual freedom, and that is the focal point for the pastor. And I think that's so important in our culture today, where conversations about freedom very quickly move into the external realm. What am I free to do? Who's treading on me? Who's messing with my rights? And Paul is always like, I will give up my rights for the sake of the gospel. Let's focus on the freedom that matters most first. So I want to really foreground that spiritual freedom. That's what I do in chapter 2. But then that does flow over. Paul's epistles always have this movement of like, first I'm going to talk to you about the spiritual freedom of justification. And then let's talk about the fact that, okay, you're still sinners and you need to sin less, right? So the first part is like, your sin is forgiven in Christ. Then it's like, okay, what do you do with the remaining indwelling sin, right? And Galatians is particularly clear on this, right? Where then he says, that we need to walk in the Spirit, and put to death the works of the flesh, bring forth the fruit of the Spirit. And that is the process of growing into moral freedom, whereby we overcome the bondage to particular sins and are more and more actually able to pursue that positive purpose to do the thing that I truly want to do, which is, now that I've been regenerated, what I want to do is to serve Christ and to love my neighbor. but there's still obstacles to doing what I want to do, which is these indwelling sins. And so there's that growth into moral freedom that's a lifelong process. And the important thing to note there is that, you know, unbelievers can't give any, unbelieving philosophy can't give any insight into spiritual freedom, but it can tell us a lot about moral freedom. The,
Uh-huh.
Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and other more recent philosophers have great insights into human psychology and to how to put to death bad habits and put on good habits. So we can use natural revelation and special revelation there. So then, on the basis of those, we can then talk about political freedom, which is our freedom vis-a-vis other people, vis-a-vis structures of authority. And notice, this is broader than kind of the political context in the sense of that we might often think of it, right? There's actually a political freedom that is exercised in relation to any institutional context that you find yourself in. And we have to have but we have to have a balanced understanding of what is the appropriate role of authority and what is the appropriate role of the freedom of the individual. And ultimately, the best reconciliation of freedom and authority is one in which we have the freedom to be self-governing. Our freedom is limited by law, but those laws are themselves laws that we ourselves have had a role in making, and that is, of course, what the American republic was all about in its ideal form. Was this is a freedom of self-government, but crucially, the founders understood that freedom of collective self-government requires first that freedom of individual self-government. That is to say, if I as an individual have not developed the moral freedom to be able to govern my passions,
Mhm.
then you don't want to entrust me with lawmaking authority, right? And I think that's part of the problem we find ourselves in today is we're still asserting political freedom very loudly, and we've really lost the moral freedom that is necessary as a necessary foundation for that. And of course, that's partly because we've lost that spiritual freedom that is even more fundamental than that moral freedom.
The thing that I kept thinking of as you were talking about the sort of moral philosophers, really just philosophers throughout history, um, any of them succeeded at a change of morality. Certainly, there has been some movement. Certainly there have been either moments in history or moments in individuals' lives where there is some measure of morality that leads to some measure of human flourishing in the self as well as in this society. But there hasn't really been. I mean, really, the history of philosophers and philosophy is also a history of debauchery very often. And so it seems like if you just jump just directly to the moral transformation, the genuine moral freedom, and you skip over the spiritual freedom, it simply doesn't work. It seems like that
Right.
translates straight to the church as well. I mean,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
like you said,
The quest for moral
nobody can skip
freedom.
that. You said even in the church we can't skip that. You know, we can't become just another philosopher. We're just religious philosophers.
Right. Yep. And I think that is often I mean, it's so easy to just emphasize one or the other side, right? Where you have churches that sort of can take the gospel for granted and then focus on behavior modification without really dealing with the root issue, which is that your behavior will never be truly modified until you've been set free by the Spirit. But then you have other churches, and I think this is probably um, perhaps the bigger problem in American evangelicalism today, that kind of just camp out on the message of justification and then say, okay, you've been set free in Christ, and just run with it, and they don't reckon with the fact that there's there's still a huge growth and lifelong growth in sanctification that has to happen, and that requires an ongoing role for the law. The law is not no longer a condemning voice. No longer It should no longer be a source of fear and punishment for the Christian, but the law is a moral teacher. The law is transformed into a guide as to what does it actually look like to walk by the Spirit. And I think many American churches are so afraid of talking about the law, talking about biblical moral teaching, that they go along with the culture of license, which is what I'm getting at in the subtitle of the book, right?
Mhm.
Retrieving Christian liberty in an age of license.
There are two quotes that I think are important here. I will often say that sanctification springs from the soil of justification. That's not an original idea, but it does spring. Justification does grow something, but sanctification doesn't grow from any other ground than justification. This is a genuine soil and a fruitfulness. But then William Cowper, I can't remember if you had this in the book or not, but in reading your book, it came so quickly to my mind, to see the law by Christ fulfilled and to hear his pardoning voice changes a slave into a child and duty into choice. So duty does not disappear.
Right,
It just becomes the moral agency and will, the choice
right.
to walk in it.
I love it.
So you become morally free to do what you now want.
Yes. And one of the things to note there is that um, you become freer to the extent that one of the important aspects that I wrestle with in the book is the way in which we think about options in relation to freedom.
Mhm.
And so we often think that more and more options means more and more freedom. But in fact, our own experience tells us that if we have too many options, we don't know what to do with them. We get overwhelmed by options. We may just choose one at random or ask somebody else to choose for us. Right? Do eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Right? Um, or we just kind of get pulled to and fro at whim. Chasing one and then another, and never actually committing ourselves to any option. And all of those are forms of unfreedom. And so, actually, this coming back to your question earlier about this freedom looks more like constraint. In fact, a constraining of our options is often what is necessary to give us the clarity to exercise that moral agency, and that's what the law of God does for us. But importantly, freedom is a dynamic process. It's a growth into maturity, and the freedom of an adult is very different than the freedom of a child. And so there's a death and resurrection pattern here as elsewhere in the Christian life, which is to say we have to put to death all of the options. We want to keep our options open. And Christ calls us to know, put those options to death, accept a limitation of your options, accept your constraints to follow me. And then in doing so, then there'll be this resurrection of a true mature moral freedom where, having accepted that constraining of your options, you'll actually find as you go further and further down the road that there are more and more options open up to you, more and more ways uh, of of pursuing excellence and of living out the call to follow Christ emerge. It's not as if following Christ is all of us are just like, identical cookie cutters, right? The saints are all as different from one another
Yes.
as could be, right? This is
Yeah.
I think this is a I don't know, there's some great C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton line that's
Uh-huh.
eluding me, right? But
Yes.
I think it's a mistake to think that people think, oh, Christians just want us all to just give up our individuality and all look exactly the same. And there is that renunciation, but that's actually in pursuit of a greater freedom and truer diversity further down the.
Something I share with my Christian wisdom students quite often is that what I desire for them in our study of theology and our study of philosophy is that they would become what they actually are. And that they discover what their nature actually is and where they are aimed as human creatures. Another way that I'll put it that they might be more familiar with because they've heard it over and over is I want them to become true humans. And you're describing a maturity. We're born humans. It's true. And we're born sinful humans, bound in that sin, but that we also become humans, increasingly so, and not just through justification, but on the ground of justification, free to become actual humans. And now we grow in it, sanctification, and we're particular humans. We stand in the category of human, but I'm this one particular human. And if I can be freed from these constraints of well, actually, I'd love to look at a couple of the constraints. You mentioned three when you talk about forgetfulness, futility, and fear.
Hmm.
As a pastor, I spend a lot of time with individuals, small groups of people, and it seems to me that many right now are paralyzed. You could say enslaved, right? Not free by what is often labeled anxiety, depression. But as I read your section on forgetfulness, futility, and fear, these sort of bondage regarding the past, the present, and the future, I thought, I just don't think I'm using the word anxiety or depression anymore. I think I'm using the language of forgetfulness and futility and fear. I just found it so helpful. How could those categories of forgetfulness, futility, fear, like I'm just thinking, we're forgetting, you know, we forget who we are. We forget we can't handle the reality of our past, as we're imprisoned by guilt. We can't handle the present because we try to do something and it doesn't work, so we become a moral philosopher and we fail at our own moral philosophy, or we actually achieve it and we find that we're no happier than we were. And then let's say we do achieve something that made us a little bit happy. Now we're in fear of the future, that we might lose it. Sounds very like Boethius, right? It would say we actually get this thing. So all of that is just riddled with anxiety,
Hmm.
riddled with a begging to become depressed, to just say I quit. I can't look at reality for what it is. So I'd love for you to just
Yeah,
spin
well,
on that just a
I
little
mean,
bit.
you summarized it pretty well there. I don't want to don't need to add too much. Yeah, if what we're called to be is moral agents, right? We're called to live in time and have a continuity over time, and that means that we always have to be true to our past. We have to live attentively in the present. We have to trust that our actions have meaning in the future, and that's where I think sin disrupts our relation to all three of those. And this is what I cover in that chapter 2 on spiritual freedom. That uh, the guilt of sin uh, makes us afraid to face our past. We know we know what we did in the past, and we can't handle it, and so we try to forget it. We try to cut ourselves off from who we were, and we just, people try to reinvent themselves. And I think this is one of those um, interesting things about the trans phenomenon today. Is that's maybe just the kind of the radical way in which people try to suppress their past. Is the most fundamental act of reinvention you can possibly make is changing your sex, right? So trying to become another person with another name, in a sense, that's just a radical sense of what all of us are seeking to do as sinners. And so the gospel reconnects us to our past by enabling us to truly reckon with who we are and what we've done, and know that it is not we're not defined by the guilt and shame of that. um, and then in terms of our present, right, that there's the alienation that we have from God, who is the source of our being, results in a sense of alienation from ourselves, and a sense that uh, that all the things that we try and do in the present to give ourselves a sense of meaning ultimately seem like they don't actually they don't give that meaning. They're all that we fail every time we try and do something. It never measures up to our expectations for ourselves. And so there's a sense of futility, and the book of Ecclesiastes is, of course, the classic statement of this. And again, the gospel restores us to ourselves there by saying, "Your labor in the Lord is not in vain." That your actions,
Purposeful and meaningful action that you spoke of earlier
right,
is, yeah, so
right,
relevant.
Christ is at work in you, and so everything that you do has meaning because it is seen. It's even if nobody else sees it, even and that's often the thing, right? Is this feeling like, does anybody else even see what I'm doing? Does what I'm doing matter to anybody? And Jesus says, yes, it matters to me. I see it, right? And then future, that sense that, um, how do I know that this achievement is going to last? Uh, how do I know that I'm not going? Things might. There's often that sense things are going well now, but you know they're not gonna, right? There's this is all just kind of like um, a the world is taunting me by making things seem good for a little while, but it's going to take it all away from me because I know that I don't deserve this. If things are going well, I don't deserve this happiness because I'm a sinner, right? And so that sense of guilt leads to the fear of what's coming next, and that's again the gospel restores us to ourselves by giving us the promise that actually what's coming next is more glorious than anything than the greatest glory you've yet experienced.
It it sounds essentially what the gospel, what the whole of the word, the testimony of the word does is it l- looks with real eyes at reality, including ourselves and the place that our lives have played in reality, is able to look at it with reality, and it becomes lenses through which we can see reality as well. I think of there's that final line, just a spoiler alert from Heart of Darkness, where um, the the wife of the deceased captain is asks the man who was there when the captain died, what were his last words, and of course, if you don't want to read it, you could just watch Apocalypse Now, and you could get the same thing. The reality was, he said, the horror, as he died. He saw the death, the darkness, the futility, and he says the horror, and she says, and the man recognizes he can't tell her what his last words were, and so he says, "Your name." That's what his last words were, "Your name." And I think that we do that with ourselves. We can't look at our own life. And so
Hmm.
we make up a pretend little history for ourselves. So it can be through blaming others. It can be through minimizing the reality of our sin. It can be by maximizing a sense of our own accomplishments. But the gospel gives us the ability to say, no, actually, the horror, the depth of depravity, and the height of grace, and then restores us to the present, that he is actually making us actually righteous. He has counted us righteous. It's true, but he's not finished there. He will make
Hmm.
us righteous as something that he will complete at the day of Christ
Hmm.
Jesus. That then restores us to our future. So we can see the horror, and we can even put it in our songs. Like blood watching us white as snow and stuff like that, because like we were that dirty. And then we can see the height of grace, um, that's on the other side. Brad, I know that we should probably wrap up soon, but there's one last thing that I have to ask. This is a hard one,
Hmm.
in many ways, because you went somewhere. I'm like, this man is brave. Okay, you recent a couple months ago, I preached a sermon called "Will You Let Me Be Your Pastor?" I'd been working on that sermon for like 2 years because I was scared to preach it. Um, Part of what made me scared to preach it is I tried to pastor my church through COVID.
Hmm.
That's hard work. And you said this may seem a bit melodramatic at first, but Hooker goes on to explain that it is, after all, the primary function of parents, teachers, and civil authorities to issue commands where God does not. I obviously put the word pastor in there
Right.
too. Um, and you did too.
Hmm.
Mask mandates or not. I just kept asking, where does it say in the Bible that you have to wear a mask? And I'm like, I don't know. Where does it say in the Bible that I have any idea what I'm talking about?
Hmm.
It doesn't. But we have to make decisions. Um, and um, and of course the contrary as well. That where so that would be a political constraint on both personal and moral freedom. Um, could you just talk about that for a moment, for on a as much as possible, just a practical wisdom and even just a counsel? I just found that your book counseled a level of uh, almost freedom to authorities,
Hmm.
like that the individual being led has the capacity to give freedom to those in authority over them, and yeah, so.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, this is the part where the book, uh, many modern readers are going to chafe the most against some
Mhm.
things I'm trying to say in the book. But really, this is it's just common sense if you want to think about what does it mean to live in community, right? If we are supposed to live in community, and we are. Spoiler alert: the
Mhm.
Bible makes
Yes,
it very clear.
and we
We are
want
called.
to.
And
Yeah.
yeah, we desire to deep down, even when we find it frustrating and tell ourselves we don't, right? Um, but and Scripture makes it very clear that in the church we're called to, we must live as the body of Christ. So to live in community means, um, any community is going to have to make a zillion decisions about a zillion questions that God doesn't answer for us. In terms of, even if you're a strict regulative principle of worship guy, we'll just talk about
Mhm.
the church context, right? You're going to admit, it doesn't tell you. There's a lot of particulars of the worship service that they would say, well, that's left up to the discretion of the individual church. What color should church carpets be? A famous source of controversy in many churches. What song are we? The example I like to give is, what songs are we going to sing in worship today? Even if, let's just say, again, you're a strict regulative principle person, you say they're all supposed to be, from the Psalms, inclusive psalmody. Still, which Psalms are we singing today? And someone's got to make that decision, and that's a decision for the community, and it's a decision that some people might disagree with. It might not be actually serving my own spiritual needs. I might really need a penitential psalm right now,
Mhm.
and yet the ones that we've chosen, the worship leaders chosen for today, are all really, happy, cheerful psalms that just they're not speaking to where I'm at right now spiritually. Uh, so, but if I'm going to worship with the community, if I'm going to be part of that community, and I'm going to have the experience the freedom of corporate worship, which is a glorious privilege that I can't experience on my own, then I have to submit to what the authority determines in that case. And that's just a really simple, obvious example of, something that then just proliferates through the life of any church, the life of any school, the life of any institution, is trying to make wise decisions within the broad moral contours that God has given us, of how is this community at this moment in this place going to honor God. And we are not all going to agree about that, but we should all agree that we need to do it together. And that means submitting my judgment to the judgment of those that God has authorized to make that decision. And this is where it's so important to have that distinction between, inward and outward freedom, because uh, the authorities in the church should never bind the conscience. That'd be the violation of the proper inward freedom of the believer.
That'd be
Binding the
more in the
conscience of,
moral, a political or policy decision that
right.
begins to infringe upon the moral freedom. Yeah.
Yes, or, well, or even on the spiritual freedom, right? Where if you
Yes.
if you say, and so this is, um, if
Mm.
if you say, this church has decided to do this, and every church, not only has this church decided to do this, every church ought to do this. any church that doesn't do things our way is in sin, and therefore, if you don't do things our way, you are in sin, right? And that is making a claim about the standing of the believer before God on the basis of this prudential determination, and that's a binding conscience, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
say so, as an individual believer, if if it's a decision being made about a prudential matter outside of Scripture, I can always reserve judgment and say, I don't actually agree with the logic of this decision. And yet I can still, and usually still should, go along with the decision. I can say, I don't agree with the reasoning behind the decision, but I recognize that those who are making the decision are trying to make a wise decision, and that uh, as part of the community, it's my job to go along with it. I would be sinning. I would be sinning by making a stink about this thing that is in itself um, a neutral thing, right? So that's where I think ministers can make that error of binding conscience, where they say this is not just a prudential determination, but um, I'm just they sort of read their own prudential determinations into Scripture, and then anybody who
Mm-hmm.
disagrees with them is
Mm-hmm.
therefore in sin. It's not sin to disagree. It may be sin to high-handedly disregard. Uh, and so, again, going back to that, um, the even something as prosaic as what to sing in worship. I've been in churches where the worship songs that were chosen I thought were terrible
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
choices,
Yeah. Yeah.
that were just not particularly God honoring songs, and not blasphemous. I mean, there have been a couple times when I've been like, you know what, I'm not going to sing those
Yeah.
words.
I'm literally just
Uh,
going to skip that part.
yeah, but
Yes.
but like not
Yeah.
not very edifying, and certainly not what I had chosen if I were in that position. Uh, but would I am I sinning to sing along? No. Am I sinning if I make a big point of just standing there stone faced and silent, or worse yet, speak up, yell out in the middle of the service, right? Nobody does that, right? And so the that shows that you can be obligated to go along with the imperfect decisions of a community, um, in order that the community as a whole can have the freedom to act and to worship God imperfectly. And that's not the same as a compromising of your spiritual freedom.
There's so many helpful things that I think are worth just noting that you just shared. There are distinctions that it is possible for a prudential, essentially policy decision to be made that does not infringe upon a person's spiritual freedom, even if they relinquish their moral freedom to make a different decision. They willingly give up that moral freedom per First Corinthians sort of stuff.
Mhm.
um and yet they maintain that spiritual freedom. It's when you begin to press a little bit further and sort of begin to constrain the means by which you are justified. Now we're beginning, the infringement has moved into a place that it's crossed a line somewhere. There's a discernment that's needed on the part of the individual when they give up their moral freedom, something that they believe that they are free to do, but they're willing to be constrained for the sake of the community. Um, and I think that's really, really helpful to process things. And I think another thing that was helpful is it's one thing to make a prudential policy decision and distinguish that between making a prudential decision and calling it then an ought. That's not prudence. It's discernment uh, of of right and wrong. And to acknowledge, especially as leaders, whether or not we're doing that. Like, say whether or not you're doing, and if that's what you're doing, say that that's what you're doing,
Right.
and then let consciences who are genuinely free from the power of sin in their life be able to then exercise their prudence, and interact with your ought. And then say when you're not Say, this is not an odd. I'm not telling you that you have to do this in order to be right with God, sort of thing. To be able to be walking in what is right with God. Say when you're not doing that, and just say, look, I just think it's what we needed to do.
Mhm.
But if everybody doesn't do it, it's not going to work around here.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
just be honest.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
Brad, so many things that I would love to talk about. Maybe we'll have to have a conversation another time. But there are a few things I want to point people to. I know you wrote an article a couple months ago in the New Atlantis, "Stop Hacking Humans." Such a great, read "Called to Freedom" and then read that article. So much overlap, especially with that last bit in the technology. I would encourage others to read that. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you would love to point people to, and anywhere that we should find you? I know you're on a Substack.
Yeah. So nothing coming down the pike very soon, but I am going to be working on an article for National Affairs on tentatively titled "Against Free Speech Absolutism," and so this is one area where I think our our bad thinking about freedom is turned into a kind of idol, the way we often think about
Mm.
freedom of speech, and don't recognize that, like everything else, certain constraints are actually necessary to have that freedom. Right? Again, a world, a room in which everybody is blurting out something simultaneously is a room in which nobody is free to speak because nobody's free to be heard. And in some ways, that's what our social media landscape now is.
You do
So,
that so well of introducing the necessity of social environment, us as social creatures, as
mhm.
necessary for freedom.
Yep, yep, yep.
So helpful.
So that's an article I'll be working on, and then I a book, just starting a new book on called "I Think, Therefore I Am," little Apple I, um, conserving the human person in a digital age. So that'll be really kind of amplifying a lot of the stuff I do in that chapter on technology. So
Yes. That's wonderful, Brad. I really appreciate it. I know that you're a person that, whether you were specifically working on a project or not, your brain's working on a project, your conversations are working on a project. You just may not even know it yet. So thank you for the good work. Thank you for serving us here at Crafted Calling. And I look forward to future conversations.
thank you. Me too.
Brad.